Hello, my friends. Welcome back to my English learning channel. Today, I will tell you a very emotional story. A story about war, hope, and never giving up. Our story takes place in the 1940s, during a time of war. The world was full of chaos, fear, and hunger. In a small European city lived Daniel Kovacs. He was not a soldier, not a leader, not a rich man. He was just a simple mechanic, an ordinary worker with ordinary dreams. But destiny had prepared for him a path full of pain, struggle, and also unshakable hope. The year was 1946. Europe was still scarred by the war. The once bustling city where Elena Markovic lived now lay in ruins. Walls scorched black, buildings collapsed into heaps of stone, and streets buried under rubble. In this wasteland, Elena, only 14 years old, wandered like a fragile leaf torn from its tree, carried helplessly by the storm. Her father had died at the Eastern Front. Her mother, fragile but fiercely brave, was killed during an air raid. Elena remembered that night with unbearable clarity. The wail of the sirens, the blinding flash, the roar of collapsing walls, and then her mother's face swallowed by smoke and fire. From that night forward, Elena was alone. For a short while, neighbors offered scraps of food, but the war had taken almost everything from them too. No one could care for a child for long. Soon Elena was pushed out into the streets, one of hundreds of war orphans haunting the wreckage of the city. She found shelter in an abandoned railway station, where rusted train cars stood like the skeletons of a forgotten age. Her possessions fit inside a torn cloth bag, a frayed wool scarf, a piece of hard bread, and most precious of all, a small notebook that had once belonged to her mother. Inside the notebook, Elena scribbled lines of songs, words she invented when the silence became too heavy. These songs were not written for others. They were not meant for money or applause. They were her way of surviving, of pushing back against the fear that crept into her chest whenever the night grew too quiet. At night, curled against the cold iron walls of the station, Elena would hug the notebook tightly and whisper her melodies into the darkness. Her voice was thin, fragile, yet it carried a strange strength, like a single candle refusing to die out in a storm. Sometimes she sang for her father. Sometimes she sang for the memory of her mother. And sometimes she sang only to remind herself that she was still alive. Other street children lingered in the station. Some laughed at her, calling her strange for singing to broken walls. Yet on the coldest nights, when hunger and fear pressed too heavily, a few of them would sit quietly nearby, listening. They never admitted it. But Elena sensed that her songs gave them something. A moment of warmth, a thread of hope in the ruins. One October evening, heavy rain swept through the city. Elena sought shelter beneath the fractured arch of a ruined church. The wind howled through the shattered windows, making eerie whistles that echoed in the empty space. To drown out her fear, Elena began to sing. It was an old lullaby, one her mother had sung to her before the bombs fell. Her voice rose and wove for the sound of rain, tender yet aching, fragile yet unyielding. In that hollow, broken church, the melody seemed almost holy. Elena did not know that she was not alone. In the shadows stood Sister Agnes, an elderly nun who had lost nearly all her pupils to the war. Tears blurred her vision as she listened. To her, Elena's song was not merely a child's lament. It was a spark of light flickering in the ashes of a broken world. The rain fell hard that October night, slashing through the broken city like icy needles. Elena Markovic pressed her back against the cold stone of a ruined church, pulling her threadbare scarf tighter around her shoulders. The railway station where she usually slept had flooded, forcing her into the shattered sanctuary. Water dripped steadily from the cracked ceiling, echoing in the silence like a ticking clock. She was trembling, partly from the cold, partly from the hollow ache of hunger, but mostly from fear. Every gust of wind moaned to the shattered stained glass windows, twisting into ghostly voices. Elena shut her eyes and clutched her small notebook to her chest. To drive away the terror, she did the only thing she knew how. She began to sing. At first, her voice was barely a whisper, fragile and uncertain, as if she feared the darkness would swallow it whole. But slowly, the melody grew stronger. It was a lullaby, her mother's lullaby, soft, haunting, and filled with yearning too deep for words. The notes rose into the cavernous space of the ruined church, weaving through the rain and wind until the sound seemed to fill the broken walls with life. Her voice carried sorrow, yes, but also something more. Beneath the grief lay a fragile thread of hope, like sunlight straining through storm clouds. What Elena did not know was that she was not alone. At the far end of the church, cloaked in shadow, stood an elderly woman. Sister Agnes had taken refuge from the rain. On her way back to the convent, she had buried too many children these past years, lost too many voices to the silence of war. And now, out of the darkness, she heard this one, raw, trembling yet unyielding. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched the thin girl clutching a notebook, singing as if her soul depended on it. Agnes knew instantly that this was no ordinary child. This voice, this fragile spark, was something sacred. When the last note faded, Elena lowered her head, ashamed as though she had revealed too much. She nearly cried out when she heard footsteps approaching. From the shadows, a gentle voice spoke. "My child, what is your name?" Elena froze. She was used to strangers, but not to kindness. Slowly, she whispered, "Elena." Sister Agnes knelt beside her, ignoring the wet stone beneath her knees. She placed a trembling hand on the girl's shoulder. "Elena," she said softly, "you should not be alone here. Come with me." For a moment, Elena hesitated. Trust was a luxury the war had stripped away. Yet there was something in the nun's eyes. Sorrow, yes, but also warmth. It was the first time in years that Elena saw a gaze that did not look through her, but at her. And so, shivering and exhausted, she allowed Sister Agnes to guide her out of the ruins. That night, for the first time since the bombs had taken her mother, Elena slept beneath a roof that did not leak, in a small room of the convent. She lay awake for hours, listening to quiet, her notebook clutched against her chest. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps she was no longer entirely alone.